Oh, hi. How are we doing this morning? World War II. Easy question. Who's to blame for World War II? And you say, I got this. It's Hydra and Red Skull. And that's close. Some of you say Germany, the Nazis, right? Hitler. Good answer. What about Japan, right? Japan attacks Pearl Harbor in 1941, brings the United States into the war. So Japan. What about the United States? Can the United States be said to have been the cause of or to blame for World War II? You said that's crazy. That's insane. Well, there are some Americans at the time who actually said that it was the United States to blame. One of those individuals, Henry Luce, the owner of Time and Life magazine, one of the most important publishers in the United States, a newspaperman in the United States at that time in 1941, wrote an essay in which he said this: the fundamental trouble with America has been and is that whereas their nation became in the 20th century the most powerful and most vital nation in the world, nevertheless Americans were unable to accommodate themselves spiritually and practically to that fact. Hence, they have failed to play their part as a world power, a failure which has had disastrous consequences for themselves and for all mankind. And the cure is this: to accept wholeheartedly our duty and our opportunity as the most powerful and vital nation in the world, and in consequence to exert upon the world the full impact of our influence for such purposes as we see fit and by such means as we see fit. What is Luce saying here? Luce is saying that after World War I, the United States was Spider-Man 2, the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man 2. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, stop this lecture right now. Go watch Spider-Man 2 with Tobey Maguire, arguably the best Spider-Man, and then come back and finish this lecture, right? Educate yourself. But in Spider-Man 2, well, Spider-Man is Spider-Man, but he doesn't want to be Spider-Man. And so he gives up his suit and his powers go away. And what happens as a consequence of that? The bad guys run all over, doing all kinds of things, including hurting Aunt May and Mary Jane, right? And yeah, ultimately Spider-Man wins, but his job is so much harder. If he had just been Spider-Man all along, maybe his job wouldn't have been quite so hard. The bad guys wouldn't have been able to make as much progress as they did. It's kind of what Luce is saying here. The United States, after World War I, is kind of like Spider-Man 2. It is Spider-Man, but it doesn't want to listen to Uncle Ben, right? You know you're Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility. The United States, as a consequence of World War I, is the most powerful nation in the world. Not maybe militarily, but economically and culturally, absolutely. But the United States doesn't want to be Spider-Man. It doesn't want to accept its world responsibilities, right? It goes in the other direction. And does that have a role? Does the United States desire to kind of retreat into an isolationism, for lack of a better word? Certainly we don't retreat, in an economic sense, we don't retreat. We expand significantly, particularly into Western Europe. But politically and militarily, we can say that these are isolationist years for the United States. Does this play a role in the coming of World War II? And the answer absolutely is yes. So, what's evidence right after World War I, the United States does not want to be what is a world power, but it doesn't want to act like a world power. We don't join the League of Nations. Remember, point 14, many of you are pointing out in your discussion boards for this week. Point 14, really important, League of Nations. Right, Wilson's there arguing for it. We don't join it. We don't want to have our hands tied in any kind of way. So we don't join the League of Nations, suggesting, again, we're as Lou said, we're kind of conflicted. We are a world power, but we don't really want to accept the responsibilities of being a world power. And so we never join the League of Nations. We do some things during the 1920s, like we're calling countries together for disarmament conferences. So we are trying to move towards a kind of international peace in an absence of war. The United States is, in the 1920s, the leader of the outlawing war movement, culminating in 1929 in I'm forgetting the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1929, in which the world powers got together and outlawed war. I don't know if you know this, war is illegal. Seems like some people didn't get the memo, but war is illegal in 1929. So the United States is doing some things, but for overall, it's really piecemeal. Whenever there's a crisis, the United States will do something internationally to try to put kind of a Band-Aid over it, but overall, the United States does not want to play a consistent world ordering role. And then the Depression comes after 1929 for a variety of reasons. It has a lot to do with the World War I debt settlement and who's not able to pay who, and that causes all kinds of other problems. The United States is a part of this too, because the United States was more or less funding Germany's debt. Germany would take American bank loans and then pay England and France for World War I. And when the United States stopped lending money, then Germany couldn't pay England and France. And there's a kind of international dimension to what's going on in the late 1920s. The United States very much is a part of. Overall, I think we can just summarize it this way. There is no consistent policy in terms of how to work out the debt repayment after World War I. And that system is collapsing in the late 20s, and that's causing ripple effects throughout all the major economies in the world, but including the United States as well, too. So, it maybe you want to blame the United States, specifically for that, right? It's a complex of problems going on. But when we look at how countries like the United States responded to this economic downturn, that's where, again, we're kind of back to Henry Luce and the United States not wanting to play its role. So as things began to economically slow down, as it became clear the United States was heading towards a time of economic hardship, what does Congress do? It passes the highest tariff in American history. What is a tariff? It's a tax on foreign goods. You have high tariffs in order to protect your industries. If you want people to buy American, you pass a high tariff. Congress in 1930, against the advice of thousands of economists, against the advice of people in the government, pass a high tariff. The understanding is, in this time of economic hardship that we're entering into, it's best if countries kind of work out their own problems, and so the solution, Congress believes, at least in 1930, is if we just get people to buy American, if we get these foreign goods out of our markets, then the American economy will be able to recover. And, who cares what happens with the international economy? The belief was it was possible to kind of wall the American economy off from the rest of the world. You might be thinking to yourself, well, that kind of runs against the logic that we've seen from your other foreign policy lecture, right? The whole overproduction argument. The implication of that argument is that the United States needs to engage with other countries in international trade, in international markets. Certainly Wilson's 14 points was all about opening a door. And here we are just 10 years later with American politicians saying, no, the key to economic recovery and stability is going to be walling ourselves off. As one politician would complain, you can't turn the American eagle into a turtle, he would say. Nevertheless, this was the consensus in 1930. Let's turn the American eagle into a turtle and solve our own problems. That was Republicans largely in control of politics in 1930. It doesn't really change with FDR coming into power in the 1930s. He largely is a part of this retreat during the Depression to isolationism. Herbert Hoover, before he was leaving the presidency, called the European countries together to an international conference in early 1933. One of the problems that the international economy was facing in the early 30s was currency exchange issues, right? Nobody knew what a franc was versus a mark versus a pound versus a dollar. Like, if you can't work out exchange rates, if you can't stabilize that, then it's really hard to do international trade. And so Hoover thought, all right, we need to get currency stabilization settled, and then international trade can proceed. Hoover helped set up this conference, but he is out of office by the time it's ready to go. FDR comes in, and a lot of presidents don't want to continue the policies of previous presidents, and that's FDR. So the European countries are meeting to try to resolve these currency issues. FDR sends a letter. It becomes known by historians as the bombshell letter, because everyone expected the United States to play a leading role in currency stabilization. FDR comes along and says, nah, not going to do it. This was kind of the key from his letter. The sound internal economic system of a nation is a greater factor in its well-being than the price of its currency and changing terms of the currencies of other nations. In other words, what FDR is saying here, well, in a term you might be familiar with, America first. We need to solve our own problems on our own. We need a stabilization here. That's the New Deal. That's all the emergency things. That's things like the NIRA that we've talked about in previous lectures. We need to rebuild the United States internally, and then maybe down the road, we can talk about currency stabilization. But essentially, FDR's message was saying the United States is going to look out for itself. It's going to take care of its own problems, and you should do the same. We're going to work on our internal stabilization. You guys should go work on your internal stabilization. And with Roosevelt's letter, it becomes clear there's not going to be an international approach to solving the Great Depression. Countries are going to do it on their own. In the United States, the country that really needed to back an international approach to the Great Depression just opts out. So we're not going to do it. So what are the consequences? What are the consequences of FDR saying I get we're Spider-Man, but we don't want to be Spider-Man right now. We want to date Mary Jane. We want to go to the plays. We want to be able to do my homework. I don't want to save the city again. I just kind of want to be Peter Parker, right? We just want to be the good old America of the 19th century. We don't want to have to play this world ordering role that Woodrow Wilson thought we needed to do. We don't want to do that. It's funny, FDR was a huge fan of Wilson, but on this particular issue, he just, in many ways, rejects Wilsonianism. We're going to do our own thing. You guys should do your own thing. And what is the consequence of that decision? Japan, which had been working with the United States through disarmament conferences, seemed to be taking the U.S. lead on those issues. Once the Depression comes and it's clear that the Americans are not interested in an international approach, Japan does its own thing. In 1931, it invades Manchuria, establishing the new state of Manchukuo. Ultimately, Japan will threaten and ultimately invade China and then all of Southeast Asia through World War II. The Asia-Pacific War began in 1931 with Japan's invasion of Manchuria. In many ways, World War II began in 1931 with Japan's decision to do this. Some in the United States were saying, we need to go to war against Japan. The realization was, if we don't stop Japan in Manchuria, then Japan's going to threaten China, and then all of Asia, and then U.S. interests, European interests. Everybody's going to be shut out of Asia by the Japanese. We ultimately, there's not a heart for going to war against Japan in 1931, even in 1937 when they invade Japan. And so we just try to, rather than engage directly with what the Japanese were doing in the 1930s, we just try to pass trade embargoes on them. And in part that leads to their attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. But what we see is the United States saying, America first, we're going to do our thing, you guys go do your own thing. Japan says, okay, we're going to do our own thing, which is we're going to imperialize all of Asia. Asia for the Asiatics, as Japan tried to tell its neighbors. Let Japan lead in creating this new kind of region of the world which will be able to resist European and American imperialism. Japan kind of meets what it sees as European and American imperialism by its own imperialism. More consequently for the United States, or more impactful for the United States, is what Germany decides to do after 1933. Again, Americans have sent a signal to Europe, we're going to do our own thing, you guys do your own thing. We're going to be the turtle, we're not going to be the eagle. Hitler and the Nazis say, no, we can live with that. We're familiar with Hitler's plan of Lebensraum, right? The territorial expansion, which begins around 1937. We're less familiar, we less recall Germany's plans of economic expansion after 1933. Before Hitler and the Nazis are looking to take territory around Germany, they are looking to corner international markets in ways that will hurt the United States. One of the hopes of Americans in the 1930s was we could, we understood we had a great trading relationship with Europe. It was kind of the main place for European goods and tourists and everything, especially by the 1920s. The economic relationship between the United States and Europe was probably never stronger than during the 1920s. A lot of it with U.S. goods and U.S. tourists heading to Europe during these years. Europe even talked about, in terms of being invaded or colonized by the Americans in this way. We understood that was really important, but a lot of Americans said, well, if Europe falls to Hitler or to somebody else, or they close their doors off to us, it's no big deal. We got South America. Fortress America was what this idea was called. We could, strengthen our relationship with our southern neighbors. In many ways, FDR tried to do that. His good neighbor policy, as it was called, tried to say, hey, that habit we had under Wilson in the 1920s of every few years we send troops in and invade you. We're not going to do that anymore. We're going to be the good neighbor to you guys. FDR, as a part of our isolationism from Europe and from Asia, we are trying to strengthen our ties with South America. The problem is the Nazis were doing the same thing. The Nazis were working out trade relationships with our southern neighbors in ways that cornered those markets and would have kept the United States out. So the Germany's doing this in Europe, but they're also doing this in our own backyard in the Americas too. Americans are kind of a little slow to realize this is going on. About 1937, when Hitler and the Nazis are beginning their territorial expansion, that's about the time that Americans are waking up and saying, oh, the Nazis are in our backyard. They have these trade relationships with Central and South American countries that effectively are going to keep Americans out of those markets. We started in State Department reports complaining about totalitarian economics, right? Not totalitarianism as a political system. We first complained about totalitarian economics, right? And this pattern of Germany trying to engage with trade relationships, even with our neighbors, ones that would ultimately hurt U.S. expansion into Central and South America. So again, we're a little slow on this. We're starting to realize that Nazis are an economic threat to the United States before they are a kind of military or political threat. Of course, by 1939, with the decision of Hitler's regime to partner with the Soviet regime to carve up Eastern Europe, and then a week later the invasion of Poland, which begins World War II in the European theater. As I said, World War II has already been going on in the Pacific theater in terms of Japanese imperialism. German imperialism is beginning in 1939 with the invasion of Poland. And now the United States needs to figure out, that they felt they had the luxury of ignoring what Japan was doing in Asia. With Germany now engaging in territorial expansion in Europe, the question now becomes, do we need to take a more aggressive role in countering German expansion? And overwhelmingly, the answer of Americans in 1939 was, the kind of Wilson neutrality we've talked about before, America first, isolationism, we had a series of neutrality acts which prevented the United States from engaging in trade with countries that were at war. There was a lot of support for maintaining those neutrality acts. Just the United States doesn't want to be a part of this. There was a vocal part of, an increasingly vocal part of the American population. You see a flyer there for the Fight for Freedom Committee asking the question, do you want Hitler in Maine? Which sounds so kind of silly, right? Could you, maybe you've seen the Red Dawn scenarios, but have we ever had a scenario, I guess we do with the Marvel movies and Hydra, but Hitler invading Maine? Is that kind of a silly question? Well, the reality is that if Hitler had been able to conquer England, had been able to take control of the North Atlantic, at some point Hitler was going to invade the United States, the West Coast. They had designs for an invasion, of the East Coast, designs for invading the East Coast. So it wasn't as silly a question as it somehow seemed. And so increasingly, as we move from 1930 to 1940 to 1941, you see the United States increasingly, and certainly FDR, increasingly moving towards, okay, we do need to be aware that Hitler could pose a military threat to the United States. Fortress America is not going to work if Hitler is allowed to gain control of the North Atlantic, and a major bulwark against him, standing against Hitler taking the North Atlantic was, of course, England. And so as early as 1940, the United States has already figured out a way around the Neutrality Acts to begin militarily arming England. The thought was we could supply England with weapons, military hardware. It's another one of those grow fat off of Europe's folly, right? The British are dying left and right from the blitzkriegs of the Germans, and Americans. Some Americans did go over and fight on behalf of the British, but for the most part, Americans were like, yeah, we'll send you military hardware and, we'll make money off of it, but we don't want to actually engage in this war. It was pretty, in retrospect, it was pretty cynical of the United States, thinking they could just, give the British sell the British military hardware or loan them military hardware. That was part of this policy, lend lease. We're gonna lease. We're gonna lend England some of our destroyers, right? And of course, destroyers never get blown up. We'll get them back after the war. No worse for wear, right? And in all these different ways, the United States is supplying England with the thought that we could stay out of the war as long as we can keep England in the war. We can fight them over there, so we don't have to fight them here. And we kind of become involved in the Western European theater in that way. Of course, what brings the United States into the war is the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But immediately the United States begins working towards Europe, because that's our primary concern, is how do we defeat Hitler and begin to open up Western Europe and Europe again to trade with the United States. So again, taking Luce's perspective, perspective here, can you make an argument, or can you see why he's blaming the United States in some ways for World War II? Right, he's writing in February of 1941, a few years. Luce was one of these Americans who's saying we need to declare war on Germany preemptively. He thought it was kind of cynical what we were trying to do with just having England fight our war for us. So Luce was kind of early to making an argument for why we need to enter into World War II. Can you see his argument for why the United States could be in partly blamed for World War II, for failing to be a world power or to act like a world power, particularly when it became clear what was happening with the Depression? We made from the decision to not join the League of Nations all the way up through the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, FDR's bombshell letter, again and again and again, the United States is saying we want an open door for American goods around the world. We do not, however, want to entangle ourselves politically or militarily with other countries. We don't want to, we recognize we are a world power, certainly commercially, culturally we're a world power. We just don't want to be one politically and militarily. And as a consequence, the message sent to Germany and Japan is, hey, the Americans are going to solve their problems on their own. Germany, Japan, we're going to solve our problems on our own. And their solution was imperialism. Imperialism that threatened to cut the United States out of Asia and then threatened to cut the United States out of all of Europe. And so, yes, the Americans and the Allies will ultimately be victorious in World War II, but kind of like with Spider-Man 2, if we had just maybe been quicker to political and military leadership, perhaps things wouldn't have been quite as bad as they ended up being. The final thing I'll say is, before the United States is even in the war, or before we've even won the war, Americans are kind of realizing this. Luce is one of those individuals, another one, Henry Wallace, responding to Luce. But all kinds of Americans are writing all kinds of articles saying, look, once this war is over and Americans have won, because everyone thought, once the Americans entered that, whoever side the Americans won, Americans are going to win. Once this thing's over, we can't do what we did before. We can't be the American turtle, right? We can't afford to be Peter Parker. We really have to be Spider-Man. We don't have a choice. And so Americans are laying out, before we're even in the war or even before we win the war, we're already laying out visions for what should American leadership look like after the war. A very significant vision was the quotation from Henry Luce is taken from his February 1941 American Century article. So you have the text of that in your notes, and I'm going to, as a part of this lecture, I'm going to have you read that and take, kind of highlight and take some notes of it, where Luce lays out in there kind of what had gone wrong with the United States and what we needed to do to fix it. Particularly what we needed to do after the war was over, right? We need to win the war in the short run, but in the long run, we need to prepare ourselves to be world leaders. And I'll let you read through that article. He's not necessarily making the world policeman argument, but you'll see, especially at the end of that article, he kind of lays out four things America needs to do if we are going to not just win the war, but make sure that that victory actually counts for something, that it lasts, and so we don't enter into World War III because of the failure of American leadership. Responding to Luce a few months after his article came out was Henry Wallace in a speech that becomes known as the Century of the Common Man. And you have the text of that in your course materials as well, too. So after you read Luce, I'm going to have you read Wallace's Century of the Common Man. In both of these texts, don't get lost in the details or just taking notes on kind of the opening parts. And in some ways, those aren't the most important parts. Skim through, look for the places where Luce is using terms like, like that quotation from earlier in this lecture. Or he's talking about the American environment or world policeman, especially the last few pages of that article where he says specifically, here's what we need to do. If the 20th century is going to be the American century, here's some things we need to do to make that possible. And then the same thing with Wallace. Don't get lost in all of the kind of warring rhetoric. But notice especially the times in his speech where he says, some have talked about the American century, and then Wallace kind of lays out his maybe alternative to Luce's vision. So as you read through these, do compare and contrast them. Okay, where are they kind of on the same page? Where do they differ from each other? One thing I will say, they both agreed that the United States had exhibited a failure of leadership between World War I and World War II. They were partly to blame for World War II. And both agreed the United States is going to have to play a more active role in world affairs after the war was over, after they won the war. All right, so go look at those lectures, and I'll see you in a little bit.